Oh, Mr. Sidhu, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are?
My name's Gurinder Sidhu. I was born in downtown Vancouver in St. Paul's Hospital in the 60s, a long time ago. So I'm a born and raised Vancouver guy. And I'm 49 years old. I'm married. I've been teaching in Surrey for over 20 years. I'm a sports fan. And
So, did you always teach at Princess Margaret in Surrey, or have you switched around?
No, I've moved around to different schools. I started off in the beginning teaching at a junior high school that doesn't exist anymore, called William Beagle, and then I moved to Queen Elizabeth High School in Surrey for a couple of years, and then I've been at PM since probably around the year 2000 or so it's 15 or 16 years now.
So how was it like growing up in BC? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in, when I was born, I was born in Vancouver, so I went to kindergarten up to grade 5, and then we moved to Delta, Ladner specifically, and then we moved back to Richmond, and then we moved back to Ladner, so I've been kind of moving around the Lower Mainland growing up, I'd say. Different parts, and I live in Richmond right now.
Okay. So, what do you teach at high school? What classes?
I've taught most social studies courses in high school. Right now, I've got Socials 9s, Socials 11, and a couple of Social Justice 12 blocks.
And then why social justice? Why do you like teaching social studies, social justice?
You know, for me personally, I just think I've always, since I was in school, been most interested in learning about history. I'm definitely not a math or science guy. I'm more a social science person, and I'm interested in. I majored in political science in university, and when it comes to social justice, I'm very interested in topics related to people's movements and human rights and topics like that. So it's nice to be able to teach the kids that information. I don't think they get enough of it in their day-to-day lives.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about the Multiculturalism Act that was put forth in the 80s?
Well, I think in our country, especially considering the changes that Pierre Trudeau brought about to our immigration policy and opening up our borders to people from all over the world and not being discriminatory, as was every other Canadian Prime Minister before Trudeau. I think once that happened and the face of our country literally started to change, that the Multiculturalism Act was something that was necessary, and I think it was inspired actually the fact that it was put into law, and that Trudeau initiated all this, and you can see the results of this in our country if you look around. You just have to look at the diversity that we have in Canada, and the fact that that those are rights in terms of multiculturalism are protected in law is a great thing, and it's something that I'm extremely proud of for Canada.
Do you think it's transformed a lot about Punjabi people's lives in Canada?
I think it has. I think for Punjabi people, I think, and you look at, you talk to Punjabi people who came here as a result of the changes to Canada's immigration policy and Trudeau's, a new mindset that Trudeau helped to bring to Canada, and you can see why people are so still respectful and are so fond of Pierre Trudeau's legacy and what he brought. So, for Punjabi people or for Chinese people or for anybody from any other part of the world that's come here, it's been, it's just been a beacon. It's been something to really to hold on to and to be proud of, for sure. Yeah.
So, what about yourself? How would you define your own personal Punjabi culture within Canada, considering you were born here?
Well, that's just it. Like, because I was born here, and I think I've got a good mix of both things. Like, I know my parents, my dad, his English still to this day. He got here in the late 50s. His English is still not very good. My mom's English is really good, but we grew up with my grandfather, whose English wasn't that good either. So culturally, I think I've got a good mix of both. Growing up, early on when I was a kid, I actually knew how to speak Punjabi quite well, and my parents used to force me and my sister both to speak it in the house, and we'd get in trouble if we spoke English. So I learned it, but then as I got into high school and into university, I kind of forgot, and I stopped using it, and I almost lost the language. Then when I finally came back into, when I got into teaching, and I started teaching specifically in Surrey, in Newton, it came back to me, just being, because you're kind of immersed in it, and the community speaks it, so I've kind of, embraced it again, and it's really good. That's just the language part, but in terms of being Punjabi, it's absolutely, it's a huge part of who I am, and when I consider, I'm Canadian, and I'm proudly Canadian, but I'm definitely Indo-Canadian, and more specifically Punjabi Canadian. I think it's, it's the best of both worlds.
So how do you incorporate this Punjabi culture in your lifestyle, just besides using the actual language?
I think it just has to do with our cultural traditions, the way we think, the way our families interact with each other, like just, our belief systems. They're so molded by the Punjabi culture, by the culture that we're raised in, that I think it just becomes, it's not something you really think of. It just becomes a mindset, and the way you kind of, the lens you see the world through, and the way you kind of, function in the world is just it's a product of it. It's part of who you are.
So would you say that the world that you look at today is kind of shaped through a Punjabi lens, even though you're Canadian?
Oh, absolutely.
Like born in Canada?
Totally, it totally is for me, and I would say that because my parents made a point to make sure that we appreciated the Punjabi culture and were exposed to all parts of it. It's not like they shied away from it at all. They wanted us to know where we came from and our background, and to respect and appreciate our culture. And because I knew there was a lot of Punjabis I grew up with that rejected it, and I never was one of those people. I still know a lot of those people to this day.
But why do you think they rejected it?
I think in my generation, when we were being raised, and I grew up in my high school, there was only maybe 10 Indian kids, 10 brown kids, in a school of about 1,200 kids. And there was a lot of pressure on us to kind of conform and to act a certain way and look a certain way and think a certain way. And I think a lot of people at that time, considering that we were in the minority, adapted because it made their lives easier to kind of blend into the dominant culture. And I was very unwilling to do that. Although I guess for a time period there, even my family was kind of wondering about me. But it's just too important to me. And I think it's disrespectful considering, what my parents, what my grandfather did for us, to turn our back on that culture. But it's just something I could never do.
So so obviously you see Punjabi culture reflected in your lifestyle through your lens, like the way you see the world. But do you think, as you stated, your roots with Punjabi culture have shifted, right? How have they shifted from you were younger? Can you just express on that?
I'll say this, it's funny because, things like going to our temple, going to the Gurdwara, even watching, Hindi movies or Punjabi movies, listening to the music, that kind of stuff, I really got away from that. And not that I was really into it that much in the beginning in terms of the entertainment part of it, but it just didn't really interest me. I had other interests when I was, for a couple of decades there, I would say sports and, Western music and those sorts of things. So what I used to consider a little bit frivolous and just kind of almost, I dismissed it. At a certain age, I kind of started appreciating it more, and I think I started appreciating it more because I could see how it brought our family together, right? So I started going to Indian movies with my sister, with my mom, started appreciating it, and I started noticing that even in the entertainment, in the movies and in the music and stuff, the topics became more personal to me, and maybe it's just a product of getting older. They just kind of hit home with me, and I connected more with them. And even in terms of going to the Gurdwara, going to our temple, it was the same kind of thing. Before, I would only go if it was like somebody really close that was getting married or something like that. I didn't go apart from that. But then I saw the value of being there and how you feel part of a community, and it was a source of pride, And I know it's not going to go away again.
That's good.
Yeah.
Do you think that the society around you, the people around you, kind of suppressed your own Punjabi culture in the past?
I don't know. It wasn't like anybody was doing that or anything like that. Because even my friends that I hung out with, there was a lot of them still were quite heavily immersed in the culture. There was others that rejected it, so it wasn't like there was any pressure that way. I don't know, maybe I just had to find my own way, and I just kind of, maybe I didn't fully appreciate it for what it was until you start realizing that it's good to belong to something. And I think with, when you're born into it, it's so deeply ingrained in you, especially it was deeply ingrained in me. Even if I had wanted to dismiss it and not be totally Punjabi, the way I live my life, I don't think I could have done it, because I think it's just part of me, and it was going to come out at some point.
And do you think like Canada has allowed for that, allowed you to express your culture, allowed you to like say that you're Punjabi without kind of like limiting that urge that was there from the beginning?
Oh yeah, I think in terms of like, in terms of legislation and Canadian society, like it is quite open, although I am concerned about, ghettoization of a lot of people in our community just kind of sticking together. And
so like kind of like how it is in England?
Well, yeah, I'd even say in this community here in Newton, right? Like you'd have like a whole bunch of Punjabi people in Surrey that kind of live together, and they don't really mix in with others too much. I don't think it's healthy. I think it's good to go and blend with other cultures and people from different parts of the world. But I will say that growing up and stuff, in terms of being Punjabi, like being easy, like for me it wasn't. Like I had to fight my way through elementary school, literally, and in high school it was the same thing. And like in terms of being identified, when people saw me, I was a brown guy. People saw me as a brown guy, and you start, kind of thinking like that too. So it hasn't always been pleasant. Far from it. There's been a lot of discrimination, a lot of racism, and I had a lot of bitterness as a result of that. But it just kind of made it even more part of who I am.
So like, reflecting on that, ultimately today, do you believe that Punjabi culture and language has been preserved in Canada?
Yeah, I'd say so. And I think, I'll say this too. Like when my family came here in the late 50s and early 60s, that generation of Indo-Canadians that moved to South, like to BC, to Vancouver, the Vancouver area, the numbers weren't that big, right? And people back then, even like when my mom came here, like I look at pictures of her in the 60s and she's wearing skirts. And, my dad didn't have a turban. He took his turban off and got his hair cut when he got here. And people, they had to integrate a lot more than they do now. I'd say since the 70s and 80s and 90s, those immigrants from India coming here have reinforced the culture even more. And you can see it in their kids, because the kids are just totally immersed in it to the point where they don't intermingle with others, which, like I said before, is not a good thing. But I think the newer immigrants have made sure that the culture is going to stay here and be strong, and it's well rooted here.
Okay, so can you just reflect on like the aspects of Punjabi culture and language that have been lost? Like let's say in your generation, like second generation people, like if you were growing up here, like there are obviously some things that have been lost, right? So can you just explain what you think has been lost in your sense? Like I know you've mentioned it before, but can you just elaborate on that?
Sure.
Like what do you think has been lost?
Well, like I would say just knowing subtleties in the culture, like whether it's like how to do certain cultural ceremonies are all about, or nuances in the language that we speak. Knowing your history of where Punjabi people came from and what they've gone through in the past. I think a lot of people, those things have gotten lost for people maybe in my generation. And like, a lot of them.
And like Canada's institutions, like specifically secondary schools, like high school, right? Do you think like the education system allows like Punjabi people to kind of reflect on their own history? I'm like,
not really. I would say, in this school where we are, in this community in Surrey, it does, because the population, it's so big here, you can't turn your back on it, and you need to explore it, and you need to teach the kids about it, and they're curious to know about it. But if we leave this community and we go to different parts of the Lower Mainland, in terms of how much attention is paid or attention is given to the Punjabi culture or other cultures, quote unquote minority cultures, it doesn't happen. I think it happens only in small ways. If you look at history textbooks, in high school, there's very little mention of Indian history or Chinese history or African history or South American history. It's extremely Eurocentric. So there's a long way to go in that respect too.
So what do you think has to be done so that people could, not only just Punjabi people, but Canada as a whole can reflect on these minorities better, like including Punjabi people?
Well, like if we're talking about the school system, just getting people into positions, whether it's the government or whether it's a school board or administration, or teachers getting involved and making sure that the curriculum is reflective of the community that it's meant to serve. That has to happen, and people individually need to do it. And we are getting more and more people that are getting into prominent positions in our society, and they're going to become advocates for this. And I think in time it will change, and I think it is starting to change as well.
So on that point, so ultimately, do you think that Canada does emphasize Punjabi language and culture as a whole? Like obviously there are some aspects where it doesn't, but ultimately, if you were to say, oh, it does or it doesn't, can you just reflect on that?
Yeah, I think so. Like whether it respects it, I think it does. I think.
So who respects who? Just
well, so I would say I'd say the Canadian. I'd say societally and in terms of legally as well, it is respected, and it's improving. In terms of individually though, like if you get into rural parts of the country, etc., I don't know how well respected or how open people are to smaller cultures in our country. But I think over time it's going to happen. Like if you look at major metropolitan centers, bigger cities with bigger diverse populations, there's more acceptance, and it's becoming ingrained in the fabric of society. And it'll spill out eventually into the rest of the country as well. But I think Canada overall, internationally, serves as a real positive, strong point for multiculturalism and Punjabi, respecting the Punjabi culture overall. Yeah, it's a positive.
So do you think that eventually we'll all just assimilate into English-speaking Canadians, that eventually that Punjabi culture and language is going to be kind of absorbed into the mainstream?
No, I don't think that's going to happen. And I would have thought that would have happened if you had asked me this question maybe 25 years ago. I would have said, yeah, what's going to happen in time is everybody's just going to blend together. But what's happened here, specifically, like I said, in this community, like where I teach, is there's the Punjabi culture is too important to the people who live here. They're not going to let it blend in. Well, there might be some changes, but for the most part, it's going to get stronger and more ingrained, deeply ingrained, I'd say, and it's not going anywhere.
So institutions are going to have to fulfill the people's needs eventually then, right?
Absolutely.
So if there's going to be an influx of immigrants, if there's going to be generations kids who are heavily immersed in their cultures, then there will be no choice but for the Canadian society as a whole to implement certain programs, policies that enforce Punjabi culture and language, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's got to be respected, and I don't know where it ranks in terms of nationally, in terms of the language and culturally, like in terms of numbers, but there's starting to be a long history of our people here in this country and positive contributions from Punjabi people in our country. So I think I absolutely think it will become a deeper part of the fabric of Canada.
All right, nice. Okay, so since the 80s, right, when the Multiculturalism Act was put in place, right, would you say that Punjabi people have kind of had the same equal access to social resources such as employment as other groups have?
No, I would say it's good that it's in place, but having something like the Multicultural Act as part of Canadian law is one thing, but getting people that are in positions to hire to fully respect and follow the Multiculturalism Act is another thing altogether. So there's a lot of other obstacles that have to be overcome. When we're talking about racism discrimination from people that are not very enlightened and people that are closed-minded and people that are just, more intolerant. So it's good that the law is there. But in terms of being fully equal, 100% participants in terms of being compared to maybe the majority of the population, it's not there yet.
So the Multiculturalism Act kind of supports it, but it's not followed thoroughly by all other people, right?
Exactly. And even in terms of accessing services, I would say, depending on who the government is and how much money and tax dollars are willing to put into certain social programs to help minority groups, like, for example, Punjabi people, that makes a big difference too. Like, we know the Conservative government that we've had up until recently for the last 9 years has cut a lot of funding for community support programs. We know even provincially here with Christy Clark's Liberal government, funding for people that need it from certain minority groups. It's not what it used to be, or it's definitely not what it needs to be. So in terms of access, it really depends on individuals to bring it to life.
So considering that from the 80s till now, would you say that we have crossed social barriers, that we have got into fields that normally would have been like unthought of?
Oh, absolutely. And that is happening for sure. Like, just in terms of positions of influence in society, we've got if you look at the House of Commons, you look at the provincial legislature in Victoria, you look at different city councils around the Lower Mainland and across the country, you look at people in different professions entering the workforce, you look at the law and medicine, all these fields. Absolutely, there's Punjabi people that are entering, I'd say, at unprecedented numbers. So whether the system has allowed them to go in, but at times you have to push your way in as well. And I think there's enough talent and intelligence and drive in our people that they weren't going to be denied regardless.
Nice. Reflecting on that, right? Would you say that Punjabi people are put on an equal playing field?
I would say, I don't think Punjabi or any minority group in Canada, an ethnic minority group in Canada, is not 100% equal, but I'd say we're making inroads and we're moving in that direction. I think it's a long process. When you consider, for the first 100+ years of our country, our immigration policy was openly racist, and society reflected that. So, since the multiculturalism policy became official law in Canada, it hasn't actually been that long if you look at, historically speaking. So it takes time. But the more people we get in our government and other positions of authority that are there to expedite that change, the better off we're going to be. And we are, like I said, we're moving in that direction for sure, strongly.
Nicely put. So, what about let's say Punjabi immigrants, like the newcomers to Canada? How would you say they're put on our equal playing field? Obviously, we have exceptions, right? But there are those who became lawyers in Punjab and come here and they're taxi drivers, right?
Yeah. Well, that kind of those obstacles that have been put up for people that are educated overseas and that have a good education overseas. I think that will end up changing over time too. That'll end up becoming better. But I think, like I said, it's just going to take time for those people to be appreciated for, what they bring to our country. And it's going to take others that have maybe gone through similar situations to help them along. I can understand why people that have a medical degree in other parts of the world are not automatically going to become able to come here and practice, and same for law degrees, that there's going to be different kinds of hoops that they have to jump through and get extra schooling, etc. But I do think in some cases it's a little bit too rigid, and I think that there's elements of racism that definitely exist in policies that exist like that, and largely put in there by governments that we've had in our country, more recent governments.
Okay, so with the Punjabi immigrants, right? Mr. Sorry, I was just gonna say, is it okay if you just stay to like side, like is
Like
it
this?
like, yeah,
Well, because I'm moving around, right?
No, it's not a big deal, but it's just like
Yeah.
So like let's just say like with those people, right?
Yeah.
The people that like come from like India, like obviously they have to instead of like having the social prestige they did in Punjab or India, right? Now they have to take on jobs which are like underskilled, right? Like
Yeah.
they have to take on jobs that do not like meet their actual credentials, right?
Right.
So like what kind of influence do you think this has on like the upcoming generations of Punjabi people? Like does it kind of perpetuate a cycle of unemployment or like unfair access to resources, or do you think the kids become more motivated and like want to do better than their parents because of that social barrier put in place by our policies?
That's a good question. I would say, well, what's happening, I don't know 100%. I don't know if I'm...
But how do you feel about it? How have you gone about it in your own experience?
Well, from my own experience, I think kids now, like if we're talking about young Punjabi people now who maybe look at how their parents are struggling, because where we live here, especially specifically in the Lower Mainland, we know what the cost of living is like. We know how hard it is to provide and take care of your children here. I think kids here should always have that at the forefront of their minds, and I think it should be more serve as motivation for them to outwork others. I think if you come from a minority background, or you come from another country, and you've seen the struggles and you've experienced the struggles that entails, that should make you more motivated to excel. So if you've seen your parents working hard and they maybe are doing jobs that they're overqualified for, they should be doing other stuff. It should inspire you and it should motivate you to outwork other people. And it's never going to be perfectly fair. And I think students that don't do it, that are defeated by it, I think it's disappointing, and I think it's a bit of a character flaw, actually.
So, with your own experience, right? Your dad was an immigrant, right? So,
Yeah.
would you say he how was it like for you when you were growing up? Were you always inspired to go and become a teacher? How did that kind of work out for you?
Well, with us, it was my dad's got a grade 2 education from India, so very low level education. My mom's education from there is not the best either. My father worked in a sawmill for about 40 years, so I saw what he went through to provide for the family, and my mom too, and all the jobs she did and taking care of us at home. And my grandfather was in the mix as well. So there was always built-in motivation for us. They didn't have to say too much to us. There was an expectation for both me and my sister. Not an expectation. Well, there was 100% expectation that we were going to go to university, we were going to get educated, and we were going to get good jobs. There was no question that was going to happen. It was instilled in us since we were little kids. And I couldn't have looked at myself in the mirror if I didn't go to school, work hard, and make a better life for myself, because that's all any parent wants for their kid, considering what my parents did for me.
So, reflecting on that, would you obviously you went through the Canadian education system, right? Do you believe that it gave you an equal opportunity, an equal chance to kind of excel and move past barriers, allowing you to be where you are today?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, there's always going to be some forms of, racism on the part of individuals or discrimination on the part of individuals. But yeah, I went through, the college and university system here in BC and got my degrees, and had the opportunity to pursue my career. And the opportunities were there, and I embraced them, and I worked hard to do it, and it was open to absolutely everybody. So I've got no complaints on that end at all. I could have become whatever I wanted to, essentially.
So it was there. However, for certain individuals, you would say they didn't fully take that opportunity, right?
So I mean, every family operates in a different way. Some people are going to look at a challenge and they're going to cower, or they're going to shrink when there's a challenge, especially when there's work involved. Some people just don't have it in them to work.
And then they'll blame it on the government, right?
And they'll blame it on the government, or they'll blame it on their own parents, or they'll blame it on anybody but themselves. Anybody in this country who comes here and doesn't, if you're born and raised, or if you're raised here and you go through the school system here and you don't make something of yourself, you've got nobody to blame but yourself. There's more than enough opportunity here.
Okay, so reflecting on that, today would you say we're equally represented in fields such as education, like teaching wise? Like if you look at like your fellow teachers, would you say that there's a roughly a large amount of Punjabi teachers and like Punjabi people in the education system?
Oh yeah, for sure. You know, like if I look around even in this school, off the top of my head, there's probably, in terms of South Asian teachers, like Punjabi teachers, there's at least a dozen or so, maybe more. And schools around this district, I know it's also similar. We've got the principal of the school is Punjabi. There's other administrators in Surrey elementary and high schools that are also Punjabi, and if we're looking at other fields apart from education, we're looking at government. We can just we just had 4 Punjabi cabinet ministers that were appointed, including the Minister of Defense, which was something that all of us can be proud of. And I think we're kind of entering all fields, whether it's private sector or public sector, and doing great things.
So in respect to education, right? Like obviously there's a lot of Punjabi teachers, right? How do you think you guys have shaped our education system, and how do you think you guys have changed the education system? If you can,
in terms of
overall, would you say that you guys have had kind of a different influence than how it was in the past?
Oh, I think so for sure, and especially in this community here, there's so many. South Asian and Punjabi kids that I think because we've got a shared set of values and way we've been brought up and the way of looking at the world, etc., that I think we bring something different to the education system that others can't. So I think for sure, and I think it's not even something that you consciously try to bring into the classroom. It's just who you are, and it's probably a way that allows us to connect better with our students that other people might not. It might be harder for other people to do that. Right?
So that's it's good in that sense where you have that Punjabi teachers put in spot, right? You have that sense of comfort that allows other students to kind of see your guys as a role model and see that they can do it as well if you guys can do it, right?
Oh yeah, that's right. And especially like shared experiences, we're I'm first generation here, and a lot of these kids are first generation, and yeah, absolutely. I think more than anything else, they know that we've gone through the system and we've, got our lives together and have good, solid professions we can be proud of. And hopefully we do serve as role models. And I think you have to have role models from your own community. It's good to have them from all communities, but they're definitely necessary from your own community because it makes it more real for the kids.
So what is reflected about Punjabi culture in our education system? Obviously we have Punjabi classes, right? Do you see events going on Punjabi events within PM?
Oh yeah, at our school, I don't think there's any other school, I would say nationally, that probably has as much Punjabi cultural events as our school does. It's just there's stuff going on all the time, almost to the point where you almost lose sight of it. It's just so common here, right? So whether it's we've got competitive Bhangra teams here that perform, there's the Diwali Fest celebration we have at our school. You come to a school dance here, there's going to be lots of Bhangra music that you're going to be hearing. Just walking around the hallways, the amount of Punjabi that you hear, you are immersed in it in this building. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so okay.
So, in terms of acceptance of Punjabis and other visible minority groups in ethnic groups in our country, I'd say, within the last few years, there's some serious concerns that I've got, and that's tied directly to government policies that we've got coming from Ottawa. Bill C-51 is probably the biggest example of this, where you've got the government that is creating an environment where it fosters, feelings of distrust and animosity against people of color, right? Specifically Muslims, but it extends to Sikhs and it extends to Hindus and others as well. And I think the government of Canada is negligent in doing this. I think they're doing it on purpose. I think they're modeling it, a lot of their behavior on previous American governments.
So this was on the past, right? Harper's government, right?
Yeah, for Harper's government, up until very recently, though, if you look at changes they've made to our immigration policy recently, and the way they've conducted themselves in terms of respecting the rights of Canadian citizens, whether it's the hijab issue or people's right to look and worship as they want and live freely in this country. They are putting up obstacles now because it's obvious that they are worried about the fabric of Canada's, the very fabric of this country changing, and they want to preserve certain elements from our past. But Canada is moving forward; it is changing, and them creating divisions between Canadian groups in our society is really, really it's disgraceful and it's un-Canadian. Actually, I would say. I could go on and on about that, but there's a long way to go. Let's put it that way. And recently, I'll say we've gone backwards in a lot of respects.
Okay, nice. Okay, so do you think of yourself as a Canadian or an Indo-Canadian?
I think of myself as an Indo-Canadian. I don't think for me, it's not possible to divorce the two from each other, but they go hand in hand with each other. I'd say they complement each other.
So can you just elaborate on that? How do they complement each other?
Well, it's the best of both worlds, I'd say, right? Because I've got this, this rich culture that's embedded in me since I was born here. And all I have to do is look in a mirror and I see my brown skin and, the way I look and stuff. And, I think I look Punjabi. There's no two ways about it. And, so in all ways, I definitely am that. But, I'm born in downtown Vancouver, like I said earlier. And, I'm a Canadian to a huge degree as well. To a huge degree, I'm a fanatical hockey fan. There are so many parts of Canadian culture that I wholeheartedly embrace and that are coursing through my veins. That the two things they're intermingled, within me, right? Very proudly.
So, what do you think the benefits of being labeled as an Indo-Canadian is? Don't you think it separates us apart from the Canadian culture, Canadian mainstream? Some argue, it allows us to kind of blend in. It allows us to cling on to our heritage at the same time, right? But don't you also believe at the same time it kind of isolates us away from everyone else?
No, I don't think it does, because I think that's the difference between Canada and the United States. In the U.S., if you go there as an immigrant, there's an expectation that you're an American first, and whatever else it is, you're second. I think the beauty of our country, and I think it's one of a very few countries like this in the world, you can be both, right? So you can be Ukrainian Canadian or Polish Canadian or Indo-Canadian, and it doesn't detract from how Canadian you are. There's just another part of you, and I think that diversity is what actually kind of makes, it binds us together. It doesn't actually drive a wedge between us or separate us.
You disagree with the concept of being a hyphenated Indo-Canadian, right? You feel that it's in essence it's kind of a good thing, a positive thing that allows us to express our culture at the same time while considering yourself a Canadian, right? Then what about the people that consider themselves just Canadian? What would you have to say about them? Why is it that they don't consider themselves Irish Canadian or Scottish Canadian, etc., right?
Well, I'd say in most cases, most Canadians do. And if they just consider themselves Canadian and nothing else, then I think a lot of that comes from them not knowing a lot about their own family background. And I think a lot of it is rooted in ignorance, actually. I don't know why people wouldn't embrace and celebrate that. You cannot just be, Canada's a country like the United States of immigrants. There's no such thing as just a quote-unquote Canadian. We're all from somewhere else. And that mentality is, I think it's extremely limited and it's backwards. and it's dated and it needs to go.
Okay, awesome. So like, how do you feel about discrimination and racism in Canada? Like, growing up, did you ever come across racism?
Oh, I've come across racism my whole life. I mean, since elementary school. I mean, when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, walking to school, older kids I'd be hearing racial slurs. I'd be getting chased by kids, all that kind of stuff. In high school as well. I played sports my whole life. I know, when playing hockey and stuff against other teams, it was nothing but racial slurs coming my way. There is no getting away from that. I think it's still out there. It still happens to a small degree, not as much as it does, but that type of mindset is still definitely out there in Canada, and it's going to be quite some time until it goes away completely. And I don't actually think it's going to go away completely.
So you think it's going to be perpetuated again and again and again? Yeah,
I think, I don't know, maybe in a few hundred years or something, when there's diversity times 1,000 in Canada, where the country is truly 100% diverse and multicultural, and there's a total fair distribution of races and people from different parts of the world. Then maybe we could talk about something like that. But as long as there's going to be a dominant majority group, there's always going to be racism and systematic racism that's going to be in place, and ignorance.
So what about metropolitan areas like Vancouver and even Toronto, where it's the other way around, the dominant group in all throughout Canada is kind of seen as a visible minority? What kind of implications do you think that has?
I think that's based on fear, for one thing. They're not a minority at all. They're still the majority, and that's rooted in fear of outsiders. And it shouldn't matter to people like that, anyways. If they're fearful of that, too bad. It doesn't make one bit of difference at all. If they're in the minority, minority or majority, be a Canadian, be a human being. It shouldn't make any bit of difference.
Okay, so reflecting on that, have you ever considered yourself an other or an outsider from Canadian society?
Well,
have you had that internal? Sorry, can I just?
Yeah, of course.
Just kind of like
this?
Yeah, perfect.
Right.
So have you ever had that eternal conflict where you consider yourself the other rather than a Canadian, or has it ever occurred to you?
Growing up, I'd say probably there was times where you question what being Canadian is if you don't feel welcome, and you're facing racism on a regular basis. So it might make it a little bit harder to embrace the concept of being of what a Canadian is. But as you grow up and you start seeing the good things that entails, then it becomes easier to see yourself that way. And like I said before, I'm born here. I am Canadian, right? I mean, I'm very rooted here, and even if there's other people who see what a Canadian is in other terms, I know what it's really supposed to be, and I embrace that.
Nice. So in relationship to that question, how do you think Canadian society overall, I know you've already discussed this, but can you just go at it again? How do you think Canadian society overall perceives Punjabi people as an independent unit in Canadian society? Is it negative? Have you, based on your personal experiences, do you think it's a negative view or a positive view, or is it a mix of both?
I think it's a mix of both, and I think people that have been exposed and have gotten to know Punjabi people, just as people, not as being Punjabi, as human beings, they're obviously going to be more accepting and just see that we're all kind of the same. Anyways, when it comes down to it, people that don't have the exposure, maybe people that live, like I said, in more suburban areas, etc., that haven't gotten to know people that are different from them, they're going to probably have different ideas altogether, and it's going to be harder it's going to take a longer time for them to understand our commonalities are way more than our differences are.
So do you think Canada's Multiculturalism Act kind of uproots that, kind of allows people to acknowledge who Punjabi people are and kind of break down those racial barriers?
I think having the Multiculturalism Act in place as part of Canadian law is it's empowering for people, and it's not just lip service. This is something that it's a foundation of our country that our country's based on, and having that in place, I think it just gives it so much weight and importance, and it's going to get further ingrained and further strengthened in the future.
So in respect to that, right? In respect to that, do you ever think there's going to be a future Punjabi Prime Minister? Do you ever feel like there will be, or?
Well, we've got Harjit Sajjan, who's the Minister of Defense, and I wouldn't have thought I would have seen that in my lifetime, honestly speaking, and that's happened. We've had Barack Obama. I never thought in my lifetime I'd see a black president. Hillary Clinton's going to be the first female president. So that's coming up. So you know what? Who knows? I mean, I've been wrong about those things, and I'm glad I was wrong about those things recently. So, a Punjabi Prime Minister, I think it is conceivable. We've got, in Calgary, we've got the mayor of Calgary is an Ismaili guy who's openly gay. And I never would have thought that an openly gay man of color on the prairies would be elected mayor of a city. That's happened. At some point it's going to happen. I mean, it's actually conceivable now to me. It's not that much of a stretch, and I'm surprised to hear myself even say that, but I mean, that really says something in itself, I guess.
So do you think that's kind of a result of policies set forth by our own federal government?
Yeah, I think the policies had to be put into Canadian law, and they had to be legitimized. And once that happened, and once we started getting a more diverse population coming here from different parts of the world, including Punjabis, and the success that our community has had, then I think it's a cornerstone, it's a foundation upon upon which that success is built.
Okay. So what about yourself? Like in the future, like I know you've become interested in the social justice program, right? Like what do you think that has to offer for Punjabi people and Punjabi youth?
Well, social justice is, I think, for all the students that we get in high school, I'd say there's rights and there's responsibilities, right? So, I mean, everybody walks around talking about, I've got the right to this, I've got the right to that, but with that comes responsibilities. So for me, I mean, it's important that everybody understands what their rights are in Canadian law, but what I always tell my students is, Punjabi kids and other kids are, you've got rights to live your life a certain way and have certain protections in this country, but you've got a role to play too, and you've got to step up and be responsible and make sure other people are not being marginalized or being treated unfairly as well, not just your own specific cultural or ethnic group.
So rather than clinging on to that, so do you think there's like a kind of a circle from being discriminated on from other groups to the point where it's kind of shifted? It's like inclusion of Punjabi people discriminating towards other groups? Well,
you know what? That's happening in certain communities in the Lower Mainland for sure. And I'd say it's
One second, sorry.
Okay. Stop.
Okay, so what about racism today? Racism and discrimination today? Do you think it's kind of shifted today from what it was before?
Well, I know in this community there's so many. Anytime you've got a situation where there's going to be a certain group that's the majority, whether they're white-skinned or brown-skinned or black-skinned or whatever, that seems to be what happens, sadly, even in the case of, the Punjabi community. So when you've got a community that's just all living together, going to school together in big numbers, and that isn't really mixing in or exposed to people that are different from them too much, then you do get ignorant ideas and reverse racism and those types of things happening.
So the Multiculturalism Act kind of took one aspect, so it allowed for kind of a perversal of what happened before, right? Rather than allowing the interchange between cultures, it kind of would you say it kind of clustered cultures together in essence?
You know what? I don't think it's the act that did it. I think it's just individuals that have done that. They've made that decision to do it. So I don't think we can, we can't really blame that. That's the onus is on people, not to be, hopefully living their lives that way, right? I mean, I don't think any group that comes from any minority group that's faced any form of discrimination before should perpetuate that or discriminate against other people, any other groups of people. It's ridiculous and it's unintelligent and it's unacceptable.
So, sorry, with respect to that, what do you see in your like classrooms today? Do you ever witness that reverse racism or? Like,
I will say we get a lot of that actually, the reverse racism, and I think the biggest group that does it is our Punjabi males, older Punjabi males in the school, because they, certain groups, not all of them, but certain individuals just tend to spend their time with others that are very similar to them, and they don't really blend in with people that are different, and they're backwards thinking, I would say, ideas get reinforced by each other, and
So it perpetuates a culture.
It does, yeah, exactly what they should know better.
So it creates kind of a new culture on its own, right?
Yeah, it does.
Distinct from its parents. So in essence, they're Canadian.
Yeah.
They're Punjabi, but they're still separated from everyone else.
Oh yeah, and that's a huge problem here. That needs to change in certain communities.
So what do you think? What do you think can be done in order to encourage people to not just stick with themselves? Like, obviously respect the fact that they're Punjabi, that they have that entitlement to express their own culture, express their own beliefs. But what do you think should happen so that they equally respect other cultures and people, right?
That kind of stuff has to come from home. That comes from parenting, right? So hopefully parents are on the ball enough to teach that to their children. We can reinforce that, and we can also teach it in the school system as well. And you model the behavior. I think as these kids get older and they kind of leave a school's environment and they go out into the world, they're probably going to start mixing in through work or through their higher education with other groups of people anyways. But it's something that definitely needs to be reinforced. Like, we should be looking outward, not looking inward so much in certain communities.
So it's put forth by the Multiculturalism Act, but then again, the individuals have kind of isolated themselves from what the act intended, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what's happened out here. So the spirit of the act itself is, people that are doing that, they're compromising the spirit of the act, right?
What about yourself? Like, how has that kind of changed from when you were younger? Were you like kind of isolated with your own group, or have you always just been equally? Because you grew up in Ladner, right?
I grew up in Ladner with like a very, there wasn't very many visible minority groups, and my friends growing up we were a mix, right? In fact, I had one other friend that was half Punjabi and half, Caucasian. My other friends were Caucasians. There was one Japanese guy who also hung out with us. I've got a mix of friends now. So, just growing up, you just kind of see that, you learn to judge individuals based on their own merits and not what kind of ethnic group they come from. Hopefully it enhances the person they are.
So do you think Multiculturalism Act enhances that appreciation?
For people that are different?
Yeah.
For me, it definitely has. I mean, but I didn't grow up in an area where I was in the majority group. I was definitely, it was very obvious to me that I was in a minority group, and I did face a lot of, issues as a result of that. I had to put, some obstacles. So yeah, in terms of respecting the Multiculturalism Act, absolutely. Yeah, I've got a, very healthy regard for it.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Mr. Sidhu.
All right, man. No worries.